All right. Hi, I'm Han, product manager on the Compose team. Over the past year and a half, we've been really pushing on the team to make Compose more useful for the way that people use Compose, which I know is a little bit like of a simple and circular statement, but this point of how people use Compose turns out to be kind of a subtle and nuanced and interesting area of study. And I think, this recent time period, we've been really pushing to really get a sense of how the very broad user base of Compose uses this tool. Compose is a very significant chunk of the overall Docker desktop usage that we observe. And I think this pushes recognition and an investment in Compose, this proudly open source tool that's been around for quite a while. And maybe the way to think about it is like, insofar as Compose is this abstraction that automates the lower level functionality of Docker CLI, lets you bring up a series of containers that are in the right set of relationships to each other. What we've been thinking about is, well, what's a layer above that? And I think about that as maybe orchestrating Compose within a larger ecosystem of all of the other tools that are part of the complex way that we develop software now. In the same way that Docker itself is leveling up a lot of its paid offerings for large enterprise scale challenges that acknowledges that level of complexity, I think Compose has a role to play in that as well. So in this talk, I'm going to primarily be talking about the push that we've been making in the open source direction. Things that we've been shipping that we're feeling really excited and proud of that are now widely available as part of Compose, and that represent this investment. And towards the end of my talk, I also wanted to give a sketch of how we're thinking about maybe this level on top of Compose as well. And some of that is a little bit work in progress, so it's just a sketch, but we'll get to that. So as I started, we were talking about observing and understanding how people use Compose. And there's really quite a wide range. I sort of think on one side, there's the home lab, hobbyist, student, or just somebody who has something set up that can be for any number of applications, whether it's learning ML, having a better grasp of some Internet of Things, like Raspberry Pi, the kind of learning projects that both allow a certain ecosystem of projects that you can start up with Compose, and also allow for that kind of a fast local development and tinkering. And there's also, maybe on that scale, similar to that scale, we also observe what I think about as like a simple prod, simple production kind of a use case, which is if I don't need 6, 7 nines of uptime and I just want to push something to production and have that be available, people do use Compose for that. It works quite well for that case. And maybe all the way on the other end of this spectrum, we also see Compose in fairly complex situations, which I often think about the way that Compose can evolve in that way. Part of its strength is that it's so easy to get started, right? It's right in the name, Compose. And that accessibility can sometimes find Compose within a context of complexity on 2 dimensions, both the dimension of how many people are working together on a given project, on a given application, and then the structure of the application itself, which, as we know, can grow enormously complex, and the ways that those things intersect together can be fascinating as well. So when I think about that more complex use case, we are observing evidence of the ways that people are wrapping Compose to be able to get the type of flexibility and control that they want. Of course, Compose has certain built-in ways for you to have flexibility. The fact that you can use environment variables to bring up different variations of when you do Compose up. You can pass in flags. You can use overrides, extends, et cetera. But there's often the need for another level of control. And interestingly, I think on the one end, there's the desire for a kind of a consistent experience. Like, I don't want to think about it. I just want to do compose up, simple as possible. I don't want things to work for me, even if the context I'm in is enormously complex. Or there can also be a desire for, like I said, a certain kind of dynamic quality where maybe there's a set of different kinds of things I want to be able to do in development. And so that I think of as different kinds of ways that we see people building around the Compose tool itself. Like if I think about Compose as just bringing up the containers themselves and making sure that they're configured properly to talk to each other, for development, there's obviously other pieces as well, and we see that being orchestrated. And then, of course, if we're also talking about circumstances of enormous complexity or situations with some level of complexity, we have to talk about Kubernetes and the ways in which people are sort of contending with the current, I would say, gap between Compose and Kubernetes as well. The desire for absolute parity all the way through is sometimes controversial. I think that for some, there's a desire for a minimum viable fidelity of being able to just quickly test and quickly understand whether what you're doing is going to roughly go in the right direction for that eventual deploy. But obviously nobody wants to maintain a ton of configuration files, so there's also this challenge of how you avoid that kind of a drift as well. So for the focus of some of the products that or features in the open source product that I'm going to talk about today, I think it's really important to just narrow into this inner loop, which I think is a place that Compose particularly shines. I mean, as we saw, there's places for Compose in the entire development lifecycle, from development to CI and staging and prod. But if we focus in on this inner loop, I think there's something elegantly well adapted to Compose insofar as this inner loop is the domain of the engineer, of the developer. And I think of Compose as this standard that's out there that is at the right level of abstraction for engineering. It has the right amount of detail that you would need when you're defining the application that you're building and the relationships between that application and how you want to test and debug it, without the level of abstraction that we might see in Kubernetes that is much more on the ops or the deploy side. And because this is the domain of the engineer, I think that ability to have that core sense of flexibility and freedom is something that Compose allows for quite well. As a bit of a sidebar, obviously there's ways in which that there's a push towards the inner loop to standardize it further, to make it more predictable, more replicable. There's, in a way, I think of it as a bit of a contested territory, but I think there's something really valuable to hold on to, which is the core creativity of what engineers do, and what I think is also enabled by the basic accessibility of Compose that we see in its usage today. Because again, the more you sort of should go to the right, I think about that as the space of coordination and standards and standardization, and it's trying to reconcile between some of those tensions between dev and ops. But if we focus in on the inner loop, we want to think about how we can make Compose better for that. I'm going to talk about 3 things here: watch, include, and dry run. So these are open source features that we've shipped in recent months that really focus in on the inner loop within that complex changing circumstance. So watch is really about, I'd like to think that it's reducing the cognitive load of your basic iterative loop. Second. We want to make it so that you can get all of the code changes that you need into your container so that it can be reflected which is especially useful for those languages that are not compiled, where you want to be able to maybe see a live reload or a hot reload, so you can immediately understand the impact of the changes that you're making on your code base. If you just need to do a little bit of front-end work in the container, there hasn't been a good affordance for that, and so I think we're moving that direction with Watch. And that's about making sure that that inner loop is reduces some of the friction that would otherwise be there. And for include, this is functionality where we want to make it very flexible in how you can structure those complex applications, right? Because I said this is in the context of complexity. You often have the situation where there's different teams maintaining their kind of piece of the larger application. And include, unlike some of the, maybe it's siblings like extend or override, allows you to bring together the configuration files without having a depth of understanding of the contents of those configurations, so that it's something that can be used more like a black box. And finally, dry run is a bit of a, I think about this as a little bit of an intersection, in that you often want to understand the impact of what is going to happen when you run a particular compose command, if you're in a situation where it might be difficult to reason about exactly what the result of it will be. And so I think about that as a sort of combination of this inner loop work as well as the context. So to dig a little bit further into Watch that I alluded to, like I said, I think it's really well designed for that hot reload experience, because we're really thinking about the ways in which we can give you different options to enable hot reload a little bit more out of the box, so to speak. So in the context where, let's look at this structure here, where you might have, let's say, like a React project or something like that, where you want to be making changes on your IDE locally, and you want to make sure that just the changes you're making are synced to the container, which then will kick off the appropriate series of live reload within the container itself. So the sync functionality there allows you to make sure that those code changes are immediately applied to the container, while at the same time you can specify what to ignore. So common case might be that you don't necessarily want to make the exact changes in the, your dependencies. Like if you have a humongous node modules folder, you might want to be able to do some testing in the container, or reload, or redo a yarn install or something that doesn't immediately require that is synced back. So that degree of control that we are trying to think about, the development scenarios where you would benefit from that control, is where we're thinking of building Watch. And we released this in alpha a couple of months ago, and in the interim, we've been really making sure that it is really fast and it's really functional for the type of development scenarios where, let's say if you are changing branches, or that's incurring a lot of file changes. We want to make sure that that is batched and debounced so that you have a very smooth experience. And just to really quickly show the syntax here a little bit, the way that you use Watch is you add a couple of lines inside the YAML, the compose YAML, to specify the kind of action that you want. So I was talking about sync. I forgot to mention as well that the out-of-the-box hot reload experience is also enabled by our rebuild mode, which just says, hey, we want to automate it so that every time you see a change, we're just going to do the rebuild with you, speed it up with caching. But that's just to remove that little extra friction of always having to, rebuild and restart the container every time you make that change. So with this these couple of lines you add inside the YAML file, you'll be able to get this really nice experience where the moment that you put something into your directory, it'll pick that up, and then it will make the change for you and give you this hot reload experience. Any of you that are particularly keen-eyed may see that this is an older version that still has our alpha prefix in the experimental, but I'm really excited our team has now released Watch in GA so that you can go ahead and check it out now as part of Docker, the latest release of Docker Desktop. And if you really want to get a little bit more in the nitty-gritty, because some of you all might be saying, okay, wait, so watch is doing this kind of like a syncing motion. What's the difference between that and volumes and bind mounts, which is the way that people have been able to get this kind of a functionality to work. Milas, my colleague, has a great talk about the nuances there in Breakout Room 5, just after this. So if you want to learn a little bit more, you can. And now include. This is what, as I said, we're really thinking about that context that you might be working in, that you may have multiple teams at an organization, that you want each of them to be individually responsible for their piece, defining their piece of the application. But unlike some of the other ways in which you can make use of existing configuration, like extend, you don't have to understand and precisely be able to override the contents of what's being maintained. So this is to encourage a structure where you can allow, let's say if you have a giant, several hundred lines of a compose file, you can break that down into just a main file that has a series of includes to individual compose files, definitions that are maintained by those who know that part of the application best. And I also feel excited that it's trying to think about the ergonomics of that and making it so that you don't have to be very, very granular in understanding all of the relative paths as you need to with, let's say, extends. So again, this is like you both get the benefit of like you're essentially, pasting together and creating the complete compose file from these parts, but without having to think too much about some of these little nuances as you're pulling it together. Again, trying to reduce that cognitive load. So. There was actually a talk right at this space a little bit earlier today. I don't know if some of you saw this, but the video should be out in a little while where my colleague Guillaume here really broke this down really nicely between include, extends, overrides, and just gives you a much more detail about where are the best circumstances for each of these. But the intention on our end, on our team, is to really give you a lot of flexibility. And of course, with that increased flexibility, there are interesting interactions that can happen there, which is why it's great that we are able to benefit from the feedback of our open source community. So I want to talk about dry run as well. You just run Docker Compose up, -- with a flag dry run, if you want to be able to see what would happen for any given command that you would do. And this has been available for a little while. We made sure that this is feature complete for pretty much anything that you can do inside Docker Compose, you can do as a dry run. And what I think is really valuable about a feature like this is that we think it's something that which should come in handy, as part of your regular testing. If you just want to make sure that Compose is going to behave how you think it should behave without any destructive effects. But a lot of times you already know that, but we built dry run because we recognize that there are circumstances where it can be very difficult to reason about exactly what may occur. So, one thing that some of you all who are following this project for a long time may be like, wait a second, dry run, include, these aren't new ideas, right? These things have been requested and they've been part of the request for some time. And I think that's, once again, speaking to what I was saying earlier about this sustained and renewed investment that we're making now, which is not merely, keeping the lights on, making sure that there's no breaking changes in Compose, making sure that it's functioning, but really trying to move ahead in understanding how we can implement really requested and really desired features that feel in line with this larger vision around Compose, that we want it to be something that really supports individual engineers in their development workflows as they're making use of Compose now, but that it is also something that we can deeply learn from and build on top of as well. And At the same time, there's also been a lot of work that our team has been doing that I think has been really important to get us to the stage where we are able to dig into some of these maybe more complex functionality. So we've had a bit of a long journey with the move from Compose v1 to Compose v2 that actually preceded this year, and our official deprecation around that was right around middle of the year, around June or so. And this was a complete rewrite where originally Compose was written in Python, and it has been completely rewritten in Go. And there was a transition there as well where we needed to address a lot of the ways in which people were already making use of certain nuances and particular ways that Compose functioned that were not entirely documented. And so being able to both use this new degree of clarity in being able to describe exactly how Compose and document how it functions. Like, for example, the precedence order of environment variables that became much better defined with this move to v2. It also was an opportunity to make sure that we were making Compose very robust and in line with the kind of development that we do on a regular cadence. And at the same time, as stewards of the Compose spec itself, we've also made sure to make the spec more accessible and make sure that the language of the spec is written in a way that is more readable. That is some work that we undertook in this year. And at the same time, we also wanted to make sure that the Compose spec is something that we're able to build on top of in a responsible way. So the aforementioned Compose Watch functionality we built originally in alpha specifically because we wanted to have a structured process where we could get feedback from the larger community and have an understanding of the different kind of use cases that people were making use of a Compose Watch with before moving it into GA and then integrating it into the spec again. And that's structuring a model of how we build functionality on top of Compose that we hope is able to meet the needs of the larger community and also get that feedback that is so crucial for us. And at the same time, to go back to the earlier point, there's a way in which the Compose, the role of Compose inside Docker desktop itself is something that we are giving this new recognition and this new investment in. And we really want to make sure that this is something that we can navigate in a careful kind of a way, where we're able to think about exactly what is the right way to maintain this really important balance, where Compose is able to be very functional and very usable for the open source use cases that we're observing, but at the same time that this is a larger community that we can build from and learn from as we're trying to think about how to make Compose much more usable for some of these much more complex use cases. And as I alluded to earlier, there's some work that is undergoing now that the best frame for the conversation is more on the kind of smaller conversations we can have in the Innovation Lounge because there's still work in progress that we want to be able to think through before announcing. But I can speak to some of the priors that I myself come with. So a year and a half ago when I joined Docker, I came with the Tilt team as part of a larger acquisition. And as part of Tilt, this was a really interesting experience where I learned a lot about the kind of development workflow that is really beneficial Hold on one second. We learned a lot of different lessons from working on Tilt, which was understanding how developers are able to be most productive in a circumstance where they're deploying in particular to Kubernetes. And there's two things that we think about there. One is the configuration file format, and the other is the interface, which really struck me. So on the one hand, when I think about the configuration file, part of the strength of Tilt was its sort of flexibility in being able to allow for a lot of nimbleness in being able to define a configuration that will be able to be reflected as you make changes in an interface, because that allows for this kind of really lovely inner loop experience. And I think about part of the strength is bridging that gap between what I think of as a producer and a consumer, because another common pattern we see with Compose is often there will be a smaller number of maintainers of the Compose file and a much larger number of people who make use of that file. So how do we make it so that it is possible for the time and the investment of that smaller number to be better leveraged by that larger number? I think there's a space there to build really good product that is able to make more accessible and more discoverable the kind of workflows that you would want to define from the producer side. And so we think about that as bridging a gap that we see in this sort of more complex context. I wanted to also shout out the team because of a lot of the work that I represented here would not be possible without my engineering colleagues. And I currently on the team are Guillaume, Nicola, Milas, and Jeff, but previously contributing to this big migration and shift from Compose v1 to v2, and also making sure that the spec is in a really good place, was our technical writer. So there's more as well. And because so much of this is this work in progress that I really want engagement with, I hope that any of you who are interested will take the time to connect, chat with me. And I will also open up the floor here for a little bit more conversation. Looks like we have about 15 minutes or so for questions, discussion, thoughts. We have a little microphone stand over there, so I guess for the benefit of the audience at home, if you can come up and speak. Any takers?
I just want to know how much of Tilt you were able to leverage for Docker Compose Watch.
Quite a bit, actually. Very good question. It's a little bit inside baseball, but the sync functionality that we were able to make use of inside Watch benefited a lot from Tilt code, quite literally.
I have a question.
Yes.
So you were showing about the watch and the sync
Yes.
in the containerized version and the local file and the build that you can do in between the two. Is there any plan, or is it already working? Because we saw in the keynote that we are proposing a sort of cloud build and things like that. Is it already integrated, or is it something that we are planning? What's your...
Yeah. Yes.
I hope it's not a difficult question.
No, there's definitely points of intersection there. One thing that that we should definitely talk about is this general move that we're making in thinking about the flexibility where not everything should happen locally, right? That there's ways in which you want to be able to leverage remote capabilities in order to either accelerate or make more flexible what is able to happen in your development workflow. And Compose, I think, definitely is a piece of that as well. What that actually reminds me of is one functionality that I didn't allude to with include is that we do have this experimental functionality to be able to use a remote URL so that not everything that is included necessarily has to be available on your machine itself. So this idea of some kind of an intersection between our build functionality, which is trying to leverage a cloud and trying to make sure that you get the fastest possible speed by maybe not running all the builds on your machine itself, I think also connects to a direction that we want to go in Compose. I will say that there's not a concrete plan right now, just yet, but I think there's a very natural intersection there. Any other questions? So I'm not sure if there's an online question component. I apologize if there is, because I don't see them at present. But given that there's not further questions for this space over here, I'm going to be hanging out in the Innovation Lounge, which is on level 1. If there's any further, maybe not questions for a larger forum, but discussions that benefit from a smaller context, you can meet me over there. We'll end a little bit early as a result.